Hi folks, in today's episode I'm going to look at how to maintain a healthy spine and how to improve function and mobility of the spine. So this was a specific request I got on Instagram, but it was a really good question that probably deserves its own podcast because I'm hoping this can be sort of an all-encompassing episode that points you in a lot of different directions. So I thought I would do an episode on it. So let's get straight into it. So how do we maintain a healthy spine? So there's sort of two major ways of maintaining a healthy spine. The first is through nutrition, or more specifically through influencing the internal biology, what's going on inside. And then the second is through mobility, though technically mobility training will also influence the internal physiology, so that's why mobility training is so beneficial. But the point is, we can look after our spine via the raw materials that we provide for its regeneration, for the rebuilding, for the maintenance, as well as through our use of the spine, how we move our spine and how it functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by discussing the nutritional and biological side of things, which I think is probably the side of things that people don't really consider or don't really know about. So the spine is made up of bones, and it's made up of joints. Presumably you know that, and it's influenced by nerves and by muscles. So let's consider the nutritional components that are necessary for the maintenance of these tissues, and surely this should go without saying, but the foods that we eat literally become the building blocks of our bodies. So we can look at this in a very straightforward way. We can ask ourselves what components are necessary to provide the building blocks of a healthy spine. So bones, and this essentially goes for all of the soft tissues, bones, muscles, joints, nerves, but bones specifically require calcium, they require magnesium, zinc, vitamin K2, vitamin D, they require protein, and more specifically they require gelatin or collagen-rich proteins. I'll talk a bit more about those later. And also apparently they require manganese. Basically they require all sorts of minerals. You also need sufficient levels of carbohydrates for energy, because building up and maintaining tissues requires energy, which is a really, really simple but foundational concept that people seem to ignore when they recommend energy restricted diets. That's something I don't want to go off on a rant, but so many of the dietary recommendations that we see actually advocate the restriction of energy, and they talk about all these other little things like these nutrients and that nutrients, but if the body doesn't have energy, it's not going to be able to do anything with all these fancy little nutrients that you're buying. So the analogy I use, it's like worrying about the chandelier in the house that you haven't even built. So when we're looking at the health of our joints, we're thinking of the foundation of our house. We need to build that, and there are key components to that, and worrying about little ancillary things, certain green powders and whatever else is not that relevant. It's not that important. We need to look at having enough energy and the major building blocks of the joints, which are what I just talked about and what I'm going to delve into in the rest of this episode. Now, when I list all of these nutrients, so I listed, calcium, magnesium, zinc, vitamin K and all that. When I list all of these nutrients, that does not mean that I'm recommending you supplement these things. That's really important. I worked for 7 years in a health food shop, and I can confidently tell you that 99.999 times infinity % of what they sell is either a waste of money, or in some cases it's actually harmful to your health. So there aren't many supplements that I would recommend. There's also an important distinction between ingesting a nutrient and then your body actually being able to use it properly. So taking calcium doesn't mean you're absorbing calcium. And there's a lot of nuance to that. And this gets into digestion and many other things beyond the scope of this podcast. But in any case, without getting too bogged down in the details, a better option than supplementation would be to suggest whole foods that are rich in the nutrients so that you can include these in your diet. So the nutrients we need, what are the foods that we can provide in our diet that are going to provide those nutrients? So dairy is the obvious one. Quality matters. Quality matters with everything, but it really matters when it comes to dairy. It should be grass-fed, should be hormone-free. There shouldn't be any added ingredients. Basically, the ingredients should just be milk. It should just be milk. You know, it's funny to think of milk having more than one ingredient. Things like added vitamins aren't good. Some would argue that raw milk is best. That's probably true. To be honest, I'm not certain on what the balanced view is on raw milk. I really like raw milk. I really enjoy it. It's delicious. I suspect that it's better than pasteurized, but you also want to make sure that it's coming from a reputable farm. So again, quality matters, but as far as I know, some people, when it gets into the issue of raw milk, they'll say, unless it's raw, it's pointless. I'm not convinced that that's the case. So just to kind of clarify that, getting dairy, it doesn't have to be raw milk, but it should be from high quality cows. It should be from healthy cows, and it should be good quality milk. Now there's also the issue of tolerance when it comes to dairy products. Some people don't seem to tolerate dairy very well, and there are various reasons for this, but in many cases you can overcome the intolerance if you reduce stress in your body and if you fix your metabolism. And that's I think a major issue that people have is they'll say, well, dairy is bad, but it's not really the dairy, it's your inability to process the dairy. And if you restore proper health, if you reduce stress, your ability to process dairy returns. So it's not really the dairy. It's sort of the analogy I use as well as like if someone were to have pain when they squat and they say, well, squats are bad. Well, no, not necessarily. Maybe your knees are bad, so you need to sort out your knees rather than blaming squats. So I would, if you tend to blame the dairy, if you tend to think, oh, dairy's just bad for us or bad for me, question that and, you know, look into that. I can provide resources on that. So in any case, even if you do have a sensitivity to dairy, I would recommend finding a source of dairy that works for you, because usually between all the different types of dairy, there's going to be one that you can handle. Because, you know, I would recommend finding some sort of dairy in your diet because it's hard to beat when it comes to a lot of the major bone building nutrients. So like I said, there's a variety of options there. It could be milk, just plain milk. It could be cheese, it could be yogurt, it could even be ice cream. I'd highly recommend ice cream. Now one other thing when you're kind of navigating your choices, one thing to consider is that lactic acid is not actually, it's quite bad for you. So you should avoid yogurts that have high levels of lactic acid, and Greek yogurts are usually the safest. And you'll be able to tell when you look, when you open a pot of yogurt, you can tell if there's like a liquid that's sort of separated from the yogurt itself. So if you drain that, you'll get rid of that excess and unnecessary lactic acid, which will mean that you don't get the downsides of lactic acid. Now, one other little note on various types of dairy. Apparently, hard cheeses, so you know the way some cheeses are quite soft, some cheeses are hard, depending on, for various reasons. I'm not sure how or why, but hard cheeses tend to be higher in vitamin K2. So things like Parmesan, like real high quality Parmesan that's certified, being from that specific region of Italy, those, as far as I know, are going to be higher in vitamin K2, and that's quite a hard vitamin to get in your diet unless you're eating things like cheeses. And some people will say that the vegetables have vitamin K in that, and I'm going to address that in a bit, but there are issues with that line of thinking. Now, one thing I'd highly recommend is high quality ice cream. It's a really, really good option, and it probably sounds crazy me saying this, but it's a great option because it provides the calcium from the dairy, it provides protein, moderate amounts of protein, and it provides carbs, and it's delicious, which should not be underestimated. The value of eating foods that you enjoy, that are, that there's a bit of ceremony behind it. We don't need to constantly be drinking green smoothies and feeling bad about ourselves and punishing ourselves. There is value in appreciating and enjoying your food, and ice cream can be a great way to do that in a way that's actually quite healthy if you have high quality ice cream. So, as always, quality matters. Things like Haagen-Dazs, vanilla, or any other ice creams that have no gums, no thickeners, no unnecessary ingredients are going to be the best. So the way to think about this is basically the kind of ice cream that you could have made 100 years ago with traditional ingredients and a freezer. So if you had the means to freeze produce, you would have been able to create ice cream. But even if you couldn't freeze, you could have liquid ice cream. But the point is that it's milk, it's eggs, it's cream, it's sugar, and it's vanilla. It's actually quite a healthy and natural product. So in terms of commercially available ones, Haagen-Dazs is probably the easiest, and I know in the local supermarkets it goes on offer every 6 weeks or so you just stock up when it's on offer. But then most of the supermarkets will have their own brand of kind of high-end vanilla ice cream, and you just look at that and you see, well, it's just milk, sugar, cream, eggs, vanilla, and that's it. So that's my little piece on ice cream. Big fan of it, and I would argue it's a health food. But anyway, I mentioned there the issue with vegetables. So or the argument, some people would argue that vegetables, things like kale, things like spinach, will actually provide more calcium and more minerals than dairy. But the problem with kale and spinach and leafy green vegetables is that when people say that, they conveniently like to ignore, or maybe they just don't know, but they ignore the anti-nutrients that prevent the absorption of these minerals. So let me explain. Basically, above ground vegetables, vegetables that grow above the ground, they can't run away from us. They can't, say if I'm hunting a deer, it can run away from me. That's part of its defense mechanism, is to be able to escape and to evade, to run away from me, or from a hunter. But, overground vegetables, they can't run away. And so their only defense mechanism to ensure that they survive and that they can spread their seeds, because they have a survival instinct, just like all living, as far as I know, all living things have some sort of survival instinct. So what they do is they create anti-nutrients that are going to bind to the valuable nutrients and prevent you from absorbing them, so that you basically, you won't be able to digest them, and they'll still be able to spread their seeds. So these anti-nutrients, they hinder our digestion, and they hinder our ability to absorb the calcium, absorb the iron, absorb whatever it is. So a lot of the time you'll see these infographics, they'll say, well, this is the amount of calcium that you get in kale, and that might be true in this sort of isolated fashion, but when that goes into your body, that does not mean that you are able to digest that. And that's that convenient bit that's left out, or maybe people just don't understand. Now there are the proper cooking, so that there is a caveat to that. Proper cooking and preparation of the vegetables will help with this. So you will have more access to those minerals if you prepare the vegetables properly. But even if you do this, above ground vegetables don't really provide much in the way of energy. Fruits and root vegetables, and on the other hand, they provide very similar nutrients. We kind of lump fruits and vegetables together because they have a lot of the same nutrients, but the fruits and root vegetables will still have energy. They still provide energy, which is really important, because there's no point putting nutrients in the body unless you have energy to assimilate those and do something with that. And as I said before, so many nutritional approaches nowadays are focused on restricting our energy, and they basically impair our body's ability to heal itself, and that's a whole big topic that we won't get into. Now, another little thing to bear in mind when it comes to these leafy overground vegetables, which don't want to be eaten. They don't want us to eat them. They can't escape, so they have to secrete these things. But another thing is that they're high fiber content, so they have a lot of fiber in them, which some people will say is a benefit, but their high fiber content can irritate the gut and feed bacteria, which is I would argue is a high price to pay if you're not even getting energy from it and you're not even really absorbing the nutrients that are there. So again, this is always spun in a way that seems beneficial, that you should eat a lot of these leafy green vegetables. But if you're not getting energy from the food, if the nutrients are hard to digest and perhaps undigestible based on your preparation, and the fiber is abrasive and it's feeding good and bad bacteria, then you're not really getting much in that exchange versus something like a vegetable or a root vegetable or a fruit where you get a lot of the same minerals and vitamins. You are getting energy, the fibers aren't as abrasive, and yeah, they taste better as well. So yeah, that's my little piece on the vegetable argument against dairy, because it is a legitimate argument and I just wanted to make sure that I addressed that. So moving on, vitamin D. We've probably all heard of vitamin D by now. You get vitamin D from sunlight, from sun exposure. So you need to make sure that you're getting outdoors, you're getting exposure to the sun. Now, personally, I've read too much conflicting information on supplementing vitamin D. So at the moment, I'm not really willing to say that you should or shouldn't supplement it. Personally, I have supplemented with it in the past and I felt no benefit. What I do now is I focus on spending more time outdoors and getting direct sunlight exposure on my skin, and that seems to be working better for me. And I'm sure there's room for improvement. I'm not saying that I've hit the perfect way of doing it, but for a while there, certainly in Ireland, the narrative kind of became vitamin D, we should all be supplementing it. There's absolutely no harm in supplementing it because it's safe to assume that we're all deficient, and we might all be deficient, but that does not mean that we should supplement it, because quality matters, because there are other factors. The sun doesn't just provide vitamin D, it provides a lot of other things, and that brings me sort of to my next point, and it's the benefit of red and infrared light. It's a really great option for overall joint health. It does not promote vitamin D, so it's not a substitute for getting actual sun exposure, but what it does is it improves energy use in the body, and when you shine the red and infrared light specifically on the spine or any part of the body, it's going to help to deliver oxygen and nutrients to that area, thereby promoting the health and maintenance of the bones and joints. So red and infrared light, they're usually combined. I have a light here it's a combination of red and infrared light. I'll provide links for that if you want to look into it. But it's one of these ridiculously important factors to health that we don't seem to have accepted yet. There's a lot of new research coming out. I imagine maybe 10, 15, however many years it's going to be common knowledge and everyone's going to own a red light. But like I said, I've included resources in the show notes because I would highly recommend that you look into it. Do yourself a favor and look into it, as it's great for so many things, not just joint health, but things like skin issues, arthritis, weight loss, even hair loss. If you've got hair loss issues, seriously look into red light, even fighting certain cancers and improving physical and mental performance. So red/infrared light, look into it, very beneficial. And if you want to maintain your spine and maintain your overall health, I would highly recommend it. So next, in terms of our nutrients, zinc and other minerals, those other kind of trace minerals, manganese, magnesium, all these things, they can be sourced from seafood, things like oysters, lobster, if you can. Again, quality matters. Liver is a really big one, but again, a healthy animal that's fed properly, so quality always matters. Liver provides lots of vitamins as well, and it should realistically be a staple of everyone's diet. I think you could probably make a reasonable argument for every human being should probably include liver, healthy liver, as part of their diet. The only thing is, I think it tastes awful, but you kind of just need to maybe suck it up and eat it. Now, in terms of protein, the key with protein is to provide lots of gelatin. So you can do this by buying gelatinous cuts of meat, things like oxtail. So the gelatin is basically more the soft tissue. It's not so much the muscle. So when we think of meat, we tend to think of steaks, chicken breasts, that kind of thing. And they're kind of what we call the muscle meats. And gelatin is the other kind of more connective tissue. That's still protein, but it's just a different concentration and combination of amino acids. So a lot of the arguments for and against meat are dependent on the inclusion of things like gelatin and gelatinous cuts of meat. So you can buy things like oxtail. You'll likely have to go to a butcher. Again, quality is going to matter. What you can do as well is you can make a broth. You can get bones. You can either get bones from your butcher. Maybe they have bones that they're going to throw out, or you can buy things like a whole chicken, and you can keep the carcass, and you can take the bones and you can make a broth. You can boil that in like a slow cooker overnight for several hours, and that's going to extract the gelatin. It's going to extract the minerals, and that, again, thinking in this very straightforward way, is going to provide those exact raw materials to build up your own joints and connective tissues. So all of those things, everything I mentioned there, all of these food sources are generally going to be helpful in maintaining a healthy spine. So things like dairy, finding dairy that works for you, seafood, then meat, making sure that you're getting, the way to think about it is eating the whole animal versus eating just the steak and just the chicken breasts. You know, it's about, because traditionally we would have eaten everything, and that's where we would have gotten those raw materials to build the other things. So you could say that we're getting the raw materials to build up the muscle, but not the other connective tissues, and not the joints, and not the bones. So yeah, think about it in those terms, and figure out a way to include that in your diet. And I think a broth is probably one of the easiest and kind of least offensive in terms of taste, because things like liver, eating heart, eating kidney can be a bit odd when you've never really eaten those in your life. So those are all the things that we can use to physically maintain and physically build up the spine. Now let's talk briefly about substances that will deteriorate the spine. So things that will take away and essentially break down the spine. So cortisol is the big one. Cortisol is the stress hormone. It impairs the formation of new bone cells. So if you're chronically stressed, you will have chronically high levels of cortisol. And if you're chronically in pain, you are chronically stressed by definition. And it would seem that all chronic lifestyle issues are the product of excess stress. So reducing stress overall, reducing cortisol levels is a major component, not just of maintaining a healthy spine, but maintaining a healthy body. And a lot of these things, again, when we remind ourselves that everything is connected and the body it's complex, but also fairly simple. Having a healthy spine is the same as having a healthy anything else. Health is health. I want to emphasize that point, that if you follow this kind of thinking and you improve the health of your spine, you're also improving the health of everything else in your body, pretty much. That's if you're doing it right, that's what's going to happen. Now, just a sort of interesting point that I think is worth mentioning with regards to cortisol is that a common procedure for people with joint pain is a cortisone injection, which is an injection of cortisol, and the hint is in the name. And this admittedly has an anti-inflammatory benefit, since cortisol does have anti-inflammatory benefits, but ultimately it's perpetuating the cycle of stress that you're already in, and it's impairing the repair of your joints. So basically, it's a short-sighted and backwards and detrimental solution to the problem. In a nutshell, cortisol is going to hamper the health and rebuilding of your joints and of your bones. And incidentally, cortisol is going to pretty much impair everything in your body. In the long term, it might improve things short term, which is where a lot of people get a lot of benefits, but long term, cortisol is bad news. And so reducing cortisol is the strategy when it comes to maintaining our spinal health, and it is the strategy of choice when it comes to maintaining any aspect of our health. So let's discuss ways to reduce cortisol. Like I said, anything that reduces stress is going to reduce cortisol. Anything that makes you feel relaxed is generally going to be helpful. Time outdoors in nature, that's been shown to reduce cortisol levels. So just going out, sitting amongst the trees, not talking, not doing anything, not occupying yourself with anything, just being there, that is enough to reduce your cortisol levels. But anything you enjoy, anything that helps you feel nice and relaxed and calm is going to help with reducing cortisol levels. Next one's quite important. Balancing blood sugar is really, really important, and likely where a lot of people unwittingly fall short. So to keep blood sugar levels stable, we need to provide a steady supply of sugar to the body. Now bear with me, this is going to sound terrible, but we need to provide sugar to the body on a regular basis. Your liver has stores of sugar, but once these run out, stress hormones are released to convert muscle tissue and stored fat into energy. And this may sound good, and it's often spun as this really good thing by people who want to sell you certain diets and certain supplements, but it comes at the cost of elevating stress hormones in your body. So your body's ability to convert muscle tissue and fat stores into energy comes at the cost of elevating stress hormones in your body. Very, very important to understand. Now, one major problem is that the longer you've been chronically stressed, the less sugar your liver is able to store. So basically, your liver health is impaired because of how stressed you've been, and this makes you more prone to stress because you're less able to balance blood sugar. And I feel like I should repeat that. People are stressed because if you're in pain, it means you're stressed. That means that you already have an impaired ability to balance your blood sugar because you're stressed. So it's so important to be providing a constant and frequent supply of energy to the body. Otherwise, when that energy runs out, it's going to start turning its own tissues into energy, which again is touted as this benefit and great for weight loss and all this kind of stuff, but it comes at the cost of elevating stress hormones again and perpetuating that entire cycle. So I mentioned the importance of balancing blood sugar because so many health recommendations, like I said, things like ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting, so many of these things work by inducing this state of stress. They work by restricting energy and forcing the body into a state of stress, which sounds awful. Hopefully when I say it like this, it sounds awful, but it is sold, it is spun. And maybe I think some people just don't understand. They haven't realized it. I learned it the hard way through making my health worse by trying to be, quote, healthy. But it's spun in this way that it just sounds good. It's sold as this benefit. But any diet that significantly restricts calories or restricts the consumption of carbohydrates or the frequency of food intake is going to create an elevation of stress hormones, because once your liver runs out of sugar stores, it needs energy, and so it uses stress hormones, it uses cortisol to convert other things into energy. And so things like ketogenic diets are the big ones now. Ketogenic diets, veganism. I think veganism in a lot of ways does it inadvertently. That's not really their intention, but it's just the reality of many vegan choices. And then things like intermittent fasting, basically all the popular ones at the moment, I would argue are guilty of this sort of flawed logic, and they are, I think, making people's health worse, and people don't realize yet, but they're digging themselves into a big hole that's going to be hard to get out of. And I know this because I was in that hole and I made it out eventually. And I'm still, I would argue I'm still digging myself out of that hole, but anyway, a topic for another day. Point being, reducing cortisol is a key component to maintaining a healthy spine, and part of that is general stress reduction, and another major part that we tend to overlook is providing food on a regular basis for your body, providing energy stores, carbohydrates, fruit, whatever it is, juice, sugar. Simple table sugar can be worked into a healthy diet. That may sound like heresy, that may sound like the devil talking. If you don't believe me, you can challenge me on it. I'll point you in the right direction. I'll show you some resources on that, some evidence. But we need to provide the liver with a steady supply of energy, particularly when you've been chronically stressed, in order to reduce the constant fluctuation and elevation of cortisol, the stress hormone. Now, let's talk about carbon dioxide and breathing. There are a lot of misconceptions surrounding carbon dioxide, CO2. I'm going to say CO2 now. It's CO2 is commonly thought of as a waste product and simply something that you exhale. You know, it's sort of like, yeah, it's a waste product. That's the way it's commonly thought of. However, having appropriate levels of CO2 is crucial to the health of your body, and I think it's fair to presume that most people actually have a deficiency of CO2 in their bodies. And to sort of make my point, I think this becomes plausible when you realize how breathing is one of the first things that gets disrupted when people are stressed. So stress underpins all health issues. When any kind of health issue develops, it's because of stress, and therefore breathing is disrupted. So hopefully I explained that point well. And you can take anything. When you're stressed, your breathing is going to be disrupted, which is going to affect your CO2 levels. So when things go wrong, people tend to overbreathe, or they tend to hyperventilate, and they tend to breathe entirely through their mouth, and this leads to the excess loss of CO2. Now, the reason why CO2 is so important is because it's necessary for the delivery and use of oxygen in the body. So you see, you might have plenty of oxygen in your body, but if there isn't enough CO2, then that oxygen isn't being properly delivered to your cells. And it's sort of like with calcium or most nutrients for that matter, they are dependent on the presence of other nutrients or other substances. So you've probably heard this, is like people will say that calcium is only worth it if you have enough magnesium. So when you go to the health food shop, they don't just sell you the calcium, they sell you the calcium plus the magnesium plus the zinc plus the whatever. We acknowledge that we need all of these things because they all work together. And so in the same way, oxygen is dependent on appropriate levels of CO2. And my theory is that, getting to why this is important, my theory is that better breathing, which means appropriate retention of CO2, so having appropriate levels of CO2 will lead to better oxygenation and blood flow to the joints. And now, when you couple this with and sort of synchronize this with gentle movements of the spine that I'm going to cover in later in this episode, you get a very effective way, I think, of delivering oxygen to the spine and fresh nutrients and all the healing nutrients and healing substances. Because there is an argument that John Sarno, he's a bit out there. He's I don't think he's alive anymore, but he had his ideas, I think, mostly in the 90s, and it's similar to some of my ideas, but he believed that most back pain is entirely psychological, and it's actually like a distraction. So the back pain is a distraction from a bigger issue that you don't want to address. And I think there's a degree of truth to that in some cases, but not all cases. And basically what he thought was that when people have back pain, they have this degeneration. It's a restriction of blood flow to the area. So you're not getting fresh blood to the area. The area isn't regenerating and keeping healthy, but that's actually sort of distracting you from the real problem, saying, oh, look at this back pain, so that you don't confront the real issue. But regardless of that logic, the issue of making sure that there's good blood flow to the area is very important, because we don't tend to have good movement of our spines, good awareness of our spines. So making sure that our breathing is good, making sure that we have adequate CO2, not just for this, but for all aspects of our health, I think is really, really important. And it's such a simple thing that you can easily implement into your self-care. So you can improve CO2 retention by working on your breathing posture. So what I would recommend you do is you pay attention to how much you breathe through your mouth during the day. And sometimes it can't be avoided. Sometimes you breathe through your mouth because you have to. But notice times when you could just as easily be breathing through your nose, yet you breathe through your mouth. So for example, when I record these podcasts and when I do all of this talking, I'm wasting a lot of CO2. And I notice that the process of recording a podcast is really, really demanding. Like I'm usually quite wrecked after doing these. So I make an effort to build up my CO2 levels before and after through different techniques that I'll cover later. But I'm also, it's probably worth mentioning that I'm still figuring out if there's a better way for me to breathe while I'm talking for large periods of time. So, it seems impossible to breathe properly through your nose when talking a lot and sort of keeping this consistent flow. So without taking constant breaths to go, I find I'm still figuring that out. But I mention this because in your life, in your job, and whatever it is that you do, you might do a lot of talking. So it's something to pay attention to. Notice times when you're having to breathe through your mouth, and times when you're sighing, times when you're yawning a lot, because you may be wasting a lot of CO2 that's preventing proper oxygenation of your body. So you're getting enough oxygen into your body, but it's not actually being delivered to the entirety of the body. Another common thing would be that if you snore at night, this can be a concern, because it's the position of your mouth. You're simply leaking more carbon dioxide. So things like taping your mouth shut when you go to sleep. So you just get some, it's called microporous tape. You can get in most chemists. I'll include a link, and I've done a video on this before on Instagram. But you simply tape your mouth shut at night, and it forces you to breathe through your nose. Now, if you have a tendency to breathe through your mouth, if you have a tendency to snore, then it's a quick fix for that. Now, long term, I think you should look towards correcting your breathing during sleep without needing an external aid. I don't think you should need tape to be able to breathe through your nose at night, but it can be a quick thing to change to make your life better, and until you learn to breathe better. So excuse me, let's talk quickly about proper breathing posture. So your lips should be sealed, your jaw should be relaxed, so your teeth should not be clenching, your eyes should be pointing forward, so that your throat remains open. So you're not looking down, you're not looking up, your throat is unobstructed by keeping your eyes pointing to the horizon, and your tongue should be resting to the roof of your mouth. Now, so for the tongue position, it's quite important. I want you to try to place the tip of your tongue on the slightly rough part of your palate, just behind the top row of your teeth. So if you run your tongue across the palate, just behind the teeth, you should feel kind of a ridged part. And sort of right in the middle there, you want your tip of your tongue resting there, and you want the rest of your tongue to sort of fill up the space of your palate, sort of like a suction cup. Now, if this isn't too clear, there are, as usual, resources included that are going to describe all of this in more detail, because that's a rabbit hole in and of itself. You might find that it was a major thing for me, correcting breathing posture, correcting all these things to do with how my mouth and jaw and throat work. I'd had a lot of dental work as a child, so maybe that's you, maybe, and I think anything that affects breathing should be a priority. So there will be resources, like I said, to delve deeper into that. Then beyond this, you can look at the rate and depth of your breathing. So perhaps your breathing posture is good and all that, but maybe you're over breathing. So there is a debate over the exact number of the rate of breathing, but I would say that a healthy breathing rate is somewhere between 6 to 8 breaths per minute. And so one breath is an inhalation and an exhalation. So inhalation, exhalation, that's one breath. So a healthy rate of breathing is roughly 6 to 8 inhalations and exhalations per minute. And you can analyze your breathing and see where you fall on this. So you could just be in the middle of something and maybe take a second to just notice your breathing, take a minute, and just don't try and change anything, just see your rate of breathing and see where it falls in that. I think in the traditional medical world they would say that 11 breaths per minute is the healthy range. I'm not going to go by that because I don't trust them, and it makes no sense when you look into it a bit deeper. But I just want to be upfront that the 6 to 8 number that's what I would say, and there's going to be a bit of debate there. But generally speaking, the fewer breaths you can comfortably take per minute, the better. So aim to slow your breathing down, become accustomed to slowing your breathing down. And if you've been listening or following any of my content this long and you're not onto slowing down your breathing and controlling your breathing, start now. Focus on that. It's probably the single most important skill for anyone with pain, particularly back pain. So for keeping, again, it's great for all sorts of things, but for keeping your spine healthy, I would recommend having a dedicated time every day to focus on slowing and controlling your breathing. You can start with 5 minutes twice per day, and you can build from there. Most importantly, you should automatically start to breathe better. So you don't, when you practice this, it will become automatic, it will become unconscious. And that's really the goal. Is if you think that we're having, you're taking 30,000 breaths in a day, if you're doing those poorly, that's a big difference between doing them poorly and doing them well. So it's so important to breathe properly and really restore your breathing quality. Let's see. So in most cases, 5 minutes twice per day and just a bit of dedicated breathing practice is going to be enough for you. But if you do a lot of activities where you're having to breathe through your mouth, things like intense sports or lots of talking, then you would probably benefit from dedicated time to breathe intently, slowly, and to restore proper CO2 levels in your body. So again, for me, I needed to put in a lot of work with breathing, and I still do, because I do jiu-jitsu, and you pretty much can't do a jiu-jitsu session without being out of breath. It's really intense. And then I do these videos, and I do all this talking now, and now I've started coaching the kids class in jiu-jitsu, and so I'm having to shout, I'm having to project my voice, and that is a lot of exhalation, that is a lot of losing CO2, and all of these things have sort of happened at the same time. I was training jiu-jitsu, and then I started coaching, and then I started doing these podcasts sort of on a regular basis, and I really felt it in my body, and basically I'm losing CO2, and I need to make a conscious effort to build that back up, because otherwise the oxygen that I'm breathing isn't being distributed throughout my body. And so I found that my recovery was impaired. Basically my health was impaired. So in the resources section, I have a couple of videos that will outline how to. I mentioned coupling your breathing practice with gentle movements of the spine. So that's in the resources section, because I can't do it justice in a podcast format. But what that's going to do is it's going to create this sort of gentle pumping action of the cerebrospinal fluid and of the joints of the spine. So it's going to get this kind of nice back and forth, getting everything flowing and moving nicely and delivering oxygen. So again, if you suspect, based on what I've said, that breathing is an important factor in your pain, in your back pain, I would highly recommend make this priority. Learn about arch and flatten breathing, COGS breathing, which are in the resources, and coupling your breathing to your spinal movement. So that sort of sums up the major points of how to approach spinal health and maintenance through nutrition and through the internal environment. Again, looking after the internal physiology. So now let's talk about the mobility, the movement, the exercise side of things. Now for this, I'm mostly going to cover general concepts and things to consider, because for more specific movements, I've included links, like I've mentioned many times, in the resources, as it's hard to properly describe movements with words alone, because some people are just going to be listening to this, and even if you're watching this, me gesturing isn't necessarily going to help you understand how to do a specific mobility exercise. So it's all in the resources. Let's talk about concepts. I think the starting point with any joint, so we're thinking about how do I maintain my joints. The starting point with any joint is to identify two things. So the first is, what should a joint be able to do? So what should a human spine be able to do, for example? And what can my joints actually do? So you sort of outline where you are now, what can I do now, versus where you can potentially be and what you can attain. So in the case of the spine, your spine should be able to flex. So for example, if you go down to touch your toes, it should be able to flex. It should be able to flex laterally, so to the side. So if you're standing up and you're reaching deep down into an imaginary pocket down past your knee, that's a lateral flexion. So you should be able to flex laterally both ways. Your spine, it should be able to extend, so as if you're looking back behind yourself, and it should be able to rotate to varying degrees. Now as you go up the spine from lumbar, thoracic to cervical, so low to rib cage to neck, you're going to get more and more degrees of rotation. Now we can talk about what degrees are optimal. I think you could debate that all day. What I'm more interested in is, can you comfortably move? Can you control the movement? Is it even left to right? That sort of thing. Again, the assessment videos go into, like, when you touch your toes, does the spine move fully? All that kind of stuff, and what things to look out for. But we can get bogged down in that. I don't want you to worry too much about that. But the point being, that is what your spine should be able to do. Now once you have a sense of what your spine or what a specific joint should be able to do, so what it should be able to do, and what yours can actually do, you can begin to restore that mobility and return that joint to its full potential. And an analogy I like to use to describe this is if you imagine a scratch card. The scratch card has that sort of, it's like a grey carbon jelly kind of thing that covers it. I looked this up on Wikipedia to explain what it was, and it was just as confusing as the words I used. But on a scratch card, when you scratch away the stuff, so you have that stuff that covers the image, and you scratch that away to reveal the image below. So the entirety of the image below, in this instance, represents your potential range of motion. It represents what is physically possible by virtue of you being a human. So if you're a human, you should have this amount of range of motion. So for example, every single human, their knees bend, they flex, but they don't really extend. Humans' knees have a certain amount of flexion and a very limited amount of extension. That is consistent, barring any severe, genetic disorders, anything like that. Your knees should be able to do that, and this, and they're restricted by certain things, but it's consistent across the board. So you can imagine that, so let's see. Yeah, so that is your potential range of motion. So the image that you reveal, the image that is below the kind of covering, that is what is the potential. This is what you should have by virtue of you being human. Then what you actually have access to is what has been scratched away. So you can imagine that maybe you've scratched away and removed a portion of the covering, but there are still parts of the image that remain hidden, that remain covered, and these represent restrictions in your these represent restrictions in your mobility. So when you scratch only part of the image away, the parts that remain unscratched are your restrictions. I use that analogy a lot, and I'm wondering if it's too visual, and maybe this only works with a scratch card in front of you. But through mobility training and through movement, we gradually scratch away at the card and reveal those hidden parts of the image. So now we need to understand, with that analogy in mind, we need to understand why your brain would restrict you from moving into those hidden areas. So we need to understand why your body has restrictions in the first place. Basically, your brain regulates how much or how little movement you can do. If it feels you aren't prepared to handle a certain movement, it will restrict your range of motion. So if it feels a specific movement or position is unsafe, either based on the experience of a past injury or a belief that you have, then it will restrict your range of motion. And to sort of illustrate this point with a plausible example would be that, say you bent down sometime to pick something up, and that's when you hurt your back. So just as you were reaching down, picking something up, that's when you hurt your back. So your brain has this idea that when you did that, this pain was caused. Therefore, this position is dangerous. I don't want to do that. So it's going to restrict that because it associates that with danger. It associates that with a past injury. So the way we improve the range of motion, the way we restore that ability to touch the toes, for example, is by convincing the brain that the movement or the specific range of motion is actually safe. We prove to it that we are capable of handling that position or that range of motion. We say, look, I've recovered from this, I've healed, it is now safe. We have to convince it. And we convince the brain that things are safe through demonstrating competence. We provide it with essentially evidence that is compelling. And the way I think about it is sort of like, you've probably watched like those lawyer shows where the lawyer's there and picking apart the argument and instilling these seeds of doubt and all this kind of stuff, and that's essentially what you're doing. You can think about it that way if you want to make it more fun, but you're basically communicating with your brain and saying, look, I know this was sore before, I know we hurt ourselves doing this, but actually it is safe now. I have recovered from this. I am capable of doing this. And yeah, you provide it with compelling evidence. Now, that's sort of only one side of it. We need to also make sure that the brain is receptive to that compelling evidence. It needs to feel safe. The brain needs to feel safe. We need to do this. We make the brain feel safe by regulating our breathing, because you could be doing the perfect movement with perfect form in order to convince your brain, but if you're breathing heavily and if you're breathing irregularly through your mouth, then you're inducing a state of fight or flight. You're inducing this state of stress, and basically you're not making the brain feel safe. So the next sort of component of it is regulating our breathing, as I described earlier and as it's covered in the support videos. But we breathe evenly and smoothly through our nose, and then we move. We move into those ranges of motion. We demonstrate our competence. We move, but we don't force anything. So you kind of think of that comfort zone. You're finding the edges of the comfort zone, but then you're just moving back out. So you're pushing the comfort zone a tiny bit, breathing comfortably, breathing evenly, and then coming back out. You're not pushing too fast, you're not pushing too far, you're working with the brain rather than against it. And we build familiarity through gentle repetition, and eventually our brain will grant us further access into further ranges of motion, because we've proved with enough compelling evidence, with enough repetition, that it is now safe to move into this range of motion. Now, this is kind of the very simple approach. Hopefully it's enough for you, but beyond this, you can get into very dedicated systems of expanding mobility, things that are, that are helpful, but I can't describe them properly in a podcast, and realistically you would need someone to teach you in person. So what I've described so far is a basic approach to improving your mobility. Beyond that, you would need to work with a professional, or you need to get very detailed, individualized instruction. And as I've talked a bit before, the degree to which you do this is individual. So it depends on what condition your joints are in to begin with, and it depends on what your goals are. So if your goal is simply to be pain-free and to just go about your life, then you probably don't need to go too deep on the mobility side of things. You can probably get away with the resources I have here without going down too many rabbit holes. But if you want to conquer the world and you want to be an Olympic gold medalist, then you probably want to go deep on all of this stuff, find a mobility specialist and work with one. So in terms of that, things like FRC, which is functional range conditioning, it's a very popular modality at the moment. It's very, very effective. I'm personally not trained in it, but it's a very good way of improving joint mobility. Now, if you can't find an FRC person, any trainer that understands the use of isometric contractions in order to improve joint mobility, people who understand that and working with the nervous system. So that's where I would fall, because like I said, I'm not FRC trained, but all of their stuff is based off the available evidence. So a lot of the stuff I covered in college. So if you want to go deep on the mobility and you want an individualized plan, that would be the way to go about it, to go with something like an FRC technique, or someone who understands working with the nervous system to improve mobility. Now, I'm going to talk, so that's sort of the general principles when it comes to mobility. And again, a lot of that is in the resources. You just need to kind of work through the different things and try different things out. Now I'm going to talk about common areas that we need to address for spinal health. So the question is, how do I maintain my spine? And, we can look at the spine very directly, but there are other structures in the body that influence the spine in quite a direct way. So the most common issue I see with people is that they lack hip mobility, and they specifically lack hip extension, which means that when they're walking and when they're moving and when they're doing things that require adequate hip extension, they are prone to hyperextending their low back to compensate. So hip extension, if you imagine hip flexion is pulling your knee up to your chest, hip extension is the opposite. So it's like kicking your legs straight back. But what should happen there is that the low back does not move and the hip extends back. So the glute contracts and the leg kicks straight back without influencing the low back. But most people I see, obviously I see people who are in pain, but most people I see lack that ability to extend their hips, which is going to affect the movement of the low back. So if you want to look after your spine, it's also important, really, really important, to look after your hips. It's important it's important to have control over your glutes and to have a conscious connection to your glutes. Again, I find that a lot of people can't contract their glutes on demand. So if you were to contract your bicep now, it's something that you can choose to do, and you can regulate the intensity of that contraction. But many people, they lack that connection, they lack that control to their glutes. Now this is important to say, this does not mean that your glutes are switched off, which a lot of people will say. It's a common misconception, because your muscles are always switched on, or more accurately, your muscles are never switched off. Your muscles are always firing. Unless the nerve to a muscle is cut, your muscles are always going to be firing. So your glutes are not switched off, but you may lack a voluntary control and a voluntary awareness of them. And so restoring hip extension means restoring awareness and control of the glutes. And again, this is just for your awareness. This can't, it can't be done here in a podcast. I can't explain that properly in a podcast, but it's just for you to consider if you are having issues with your spine, and if you want to maintain your spine, you're going to want to look at your hips and your glutes as well. Moving on from the hips, we kind of need to consider that hips doing their job is dependent on the knees doing their job, and then the knees doing their job is dependent on the feet and ankles doing their job. And you can sort of do this with any part of the body. There are chains of things, and you can follow those out from the fingertips down to the toes and so on. But just to kind of cover the general overview of this, is that if you're interested in maintaining the health of your spine, you need to consider how the hips, how the knees, how the ankles are doing. So ask yourself, can you move through their entire range of motion? Are they restricted? Do they lack control? Are there differences from one side to the other? And that's a big one, because you might have restriction, but maybe it's restriction on both sides and it's equal. And that's not going to be as much of a cause for concern unless it's a really, really significant restriction. So consider very much, is there a difference from one side to the other? Because like I said, you can get a bit bogged down in like the degrees. Maybe I need one more degree, or 2, 3, 4, 5 more degrees of movement here. But I don't think it's that important unless there are major differences from one side to the other, and one side is really restricted when the other is fine. So establish what each joint can do versus what it should be able to do, and then go about restoring full range of motion where necessary. So again, supposing you're focused on your spine, then check the hips, the knees, the feet, the ankles, and see, is one of them restricted? Is there room for improvement in one of these areas or a couple of these areas? And if one really stands out, then make that a priority alongside your spinal mobility and maintenance. So a final kind of topic that I should probably cover is sort of loading the spine. So ways we can maintain the health of the spine are through use and through putting force through it, because we need to be able to navigate gravity, and we need to be able to handle that, and most of us will be able to do that fine. But you need to, I think, if you want to have good spinal health long term, you need to kind of familiarize yourself with the forces of gravity, and you need to have an awareness of your posture, and you need to know the limitations of your posture and all those kinds of things. Now, the extent to which you pursue this is again dependent on your goals. If you're simply interested in maintaining the health of your spine, but you don't have any major physical ambitions, and also maybe you don't have any major issues to begin with, then I would say that walking as an exercise is probably enough to maintain your spinal health, as long as you have the nutrition and internal side of things taken care of. But you kind of think of it this way: you prepare your spine by doing the things that you intend to do. So asking, how do I maintain the health of my spine, is kind of a general question. But more specifically, well, what do you want your spine to be able to do? So I want to maintain my spine until I'm, for the entirety of my life. So when you're 90, or maybe hopefully you live to 110, but when you're 110, what do you expect from your spine? what you still want to be able to do. Do you want to be able to squat 200 kilos? Or do you want to just be able to go about your day and feel comfortable and feel, and not be in pain, to go about your business? So you need to consider what it is that your goal is, and you prepare your spine for that, and you prepare any part of your body for that by doing the things that you intend to do. So if you simply want to keep moving into old age and to be comfortable, then you do those things. You don't necessarily have to worry about squatting, but you do those things. But if squatting is important to you, then you squat appropriately. And personally, I have no interest in squatting, and I'm not convinced that it's of much use to my goals in my life, so I don't do it. But if I go a lifetime without squatting heavy weights, I won't expect to be able to do it when I'm old. So, you use it or you lose it, or you use what you don't wish to lose. So again, it's a bigger discussion of what are your goals and what are your priorities, because that's going to influence how we approach things. So you need to ask yourself, well, what is the ultimate goal? And for me, an ultimate goal might be to be able to just, if I needed to climb over a wall, I'd be able to. If I wanted to climb a tree, I'd be able to. If I needed to pick something up, you could call it functional training or whatever, but I'm not interested in anything too crazy or any crazy sports or weightlifting for the sake of weightlifting. So that's going to inform how I approach the maintenance of my spine. But if you want to be 90 and the person in the gym doing deadlifts, then deadlifts are going to be part of the way that you maintain your spine and you prepare it for those loads. So if you just want a healthy spine for everyday life, I think look after the diet, look after the breathing side of things first and foremost, and just keep moving. Things as simple as walking. I can't overstate the importance and the value of walking, but things like walking and just gentle movements of the spine that are covered in the resources, moving the spine in 3 dimensions while synchronized with your breathing. That plus taking care of the diet, taking care of the internal, I think should be enough. Now, if you're really, really serious about putting your spine through very demanding things, and if you know that you're going to be pushing the limits of what your body can do for the bulk of your life, and you want to master that and you want to stay ahead of that, then it may be worth looking at a system like functional patterns or anatomy in motion. And probably I would recommend you do both of those, because they are different, but I think in my experience they complement each other very well. And these kind of methods, they will teach you good awareness and control of your spine and how to actively decompress your spine. And so, I use anatomy in motion, parts of functional patterns, and I understand how to actively decompress my spine and how to navigate gravity. So maybe I'm ignoring that fact and I'm kind of not acknowledging the point that I've gotten to. So maybe it is beneficial for everyone to do this, but I think for most people you'll get away with focusing on the breathing, the nutrition, and just general movement and keeping active. But yeah, if you're really into this stuff, if you want to get ahead of things and if you want to maximize the health of your body and the health of your spine, something like functional patterns, and I wouldn't even say something like functional patterns or anatomy in motion, because they're fairly unique. I'm going to say functional patterns and anatomy in motion. I'm only affiliated to anatomy in motion. I just have experience of functional patterns, and I think what they're doing is good. I'm going to do a video on them in a bit. But those two methods, if you want to learn how to navigate gravity and to actively decompress your spine and to have a healthy spine for very tough and demanding purposes, they would be the methods to pursue. And as I've mentioned before, they're far, far too complex for me to do them justice in something like a podcast. You need to work with a trained professional when it comes to that. So I should also say those recommendations, they are just my opinion and they are my biased opinion. But I would also say that I think I won't give I'm fairly aware of my biases, and I think I'm not that quick to give out recommendations for specific methodologies and specific techniques. So bear that in mind. So when I recommend those, I'm pretty confident with those recommendations. So anyway, that about covers everything I think you need. You need to know, you need to apply to maintain a healthy spine. I think most people focus on the exercise and mobility side of things. That's what seems most tangible and what's most obvious, and that is very clearly important. But I suspect that the nutrition and the internal physiology side of things, I believe those are actually more important. I think that if you move in a variety of ways in your day-to-day life, meaning, by that I mean you don't sit or stand in one position for 8 hours of the day. So you go about your day and you do things, you move in a variety of ways. You pick things up, you put things overhead, you walk, you carry, you lift, you push, you pull. You do that on a daily basis. As long as you do that, your spine and the overall health of your tissues will be fine once you look after the internal physiology. Once you look after the foods you're eating and the internal chemistry, which is regulated by your breathing. I personally think the focus on exercise is partially to make up for the fact that the physiological side is so messed up for so many of us. I think when you take care of that, when you take care of the physiology, the nutrition, the idea of exercise, it sort of becomes obsolete and nonsensical, unless you're preparing for specific and demanding tasks. So unless you're specifically preparing to lift heavy weights, then obviously you should train that way. But I think for the average person, the whole idea of exercise is, to be honest, a bit of a sham. And I should probably unpack that. That's too big of a conversation, so I probably shouldn't have said that. But yeah, I think it's this whole idea that's been kind of fabricated, and we're now kind of justifying it because our industry is based on it. But that'll be another topic for another day. But again, these are just my thoughts. They're probably not going to be popular thoughts. Probably not going to be common thoughts. Those are just my thoughts, and just take them in, consider them, discard them if you want, take what's valuable. Wrapping up, I would say try out the various strategies that I mentioned. Try the various assessments. So I'll have links to assess your low back, assess your spine, assess your hips, assess your knees and all that. Go through all that, try the various mobility techniques, and just find a routine that kind of fits in with your life. And what you'll find is that 5, 10, 15 minutes a day of just being a bit more intentional with how you look after your spine and how you approach your health and your mobility is going to go a long way towards keeping your spine healthy for life, and it'll become second nature. So now I'm confident that by the time I'm going to live to at least 105, but I'm confident that for the rest of my life my spine health is going to be good, because it's sort of automatic now. I've done this stuff, I've studied it, it's just sort of part of my life. But there was a time when it wasn't, and you just do it long enough that it just becomes a part of who you are, becomes a part of your identity. So yeah, there you go. Final thoughts. As I mentioned at the start, this was a specific topic request that I got on Instagram. So if you would like me to cover anything in particular, please just let me know, message me, and I will try to dedicate an entire episode to it, because I'm always looking for things to talk about, and sometimes I run out of ideas. I'm also gonna start bringing on more guests. I hadn't been having many guests on, so I've got a few guests lined up for the future, and I'm gonna try and make that more of a regular thing, partially to kind of save my voice, because I'm realizing how physically demanding it is to just be talking for like an hour, until I can figure out a better way to cope with that stress. So anyway, just a little bit about my life there, a little color for the report. So if you have any questions, anything that I mentioned that doesn't make sense, anything in the resources that you need help with, you can email me at PA, the letters PA, at thebackpaincoach.net, and I would be delighted to help you and point you in the right direction. So that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. It's a long one today. I hope you made it this far. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Physical Education Podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes to help others, then share this with someone in need. If you found value in the information here, they will too. So please share this in whatever way you can. If you have any questions, you can email me directly at pa@thebackpaincoach.net. I may even use your question for a future podcast episode. If you'd like more information to help you overcome pain, be sure to follow The Back Pain Coach on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube, and to join my newsletter. The major turning points in my own recovery have come from changes in perception and through learning more about myself. I believe that we can help others by sharing information that expands their minds. Finally, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher so that others may find this information and you can play a positive role in their healing journey. Thanks again for listening.